Thank you, Kim, and thank you for reminding us about really some of the real tragedies of residential schools that unfortunately are still in our prisons. And we thank you for all of the work that you continue to do to shine a light on that and in some of the darkest places. We thank Elder Commanda and Elder Rita and Igai for your beautiful words and prayers and for the ceremony that is so appropriate as we mark this day and ici sur le territoire traditionnel des peuples algonquins. And again, we thank Tom because this is about the survivors and this is for your voice this morning and on behalf of all survivors. And we often think about the voices of survivors, but also as the TRC Commission continue to remind us for the children that were taken, but for the parents left behind. And I think that, as Elder Commanda and Kim know, that at all the gatherings on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that the connection to residential schools or 60 Scoop, it really, so many of the women that are missing and or murdered had some history of either a child welfare system, the parent that had their child taken from them. So it is, I think, really important, as Kim said, as we mark this day, that we are marking this journey that we are taking together. And so we are, with huge gratitude, to be able to have Evelyn Korkmaz for being able to speak her truth to us this morning. It is also an honor to be here with Teresa Edwards from the Legacy of Hope Foundation. I think that it is at occasions like this that we also get to shine a light on the excellent work that is ongoing by Legacy of Hope in their mandate to teach what none of us really learned in school, and how that has to that we are recommitting to that. It is also wonderful to be here in this space and by the water and where we mark National Indigenous Peoples Day every June, and in this June now being National Indigenous History Month, that again that there are a number of opportunities during this month for us to again be able to fill in those gaps of what we didn't learn in school. It is as Tom said at the ceremony that is we thank all of the survivors that have gone to the spirit world, but we also are thanking every day the opportunity for a new beginning, and that we thank we have to take that opportunity to say we have another day, and as the Prime Minister says, better is always possible. It was 10 years ago today that the Government of Canada delivered its apology to the survivors of Indian residential schools. I was there. I remember it very clearly, being there in the chamber and seeing the faces of the survivors who were there, to see them in the balconies over our head, and to see how important that apology was to them. It's also been important in this past decade, the number of people who come and mention where they were and when they heard the apology, and whether it was in their community or with their grandmother, that apology is hugely important to people in order to, as part of healing and part of going forward. It is important for survivors, but for so many things in the way that we think of restorative justice, when we think that we have to admit harm was done, that we're sorry, and that we're going to put in place the kinds of actions that make sure these kinds of things never happen again. So it was a time of the government of Canada saying it was sorry. And we know that an apology is only ever this first step, that apology without action following it ends up almost hurting again if we can't follow up with the kind of work that we know we need to do. There are many more apologies that we need to make. I think that we began with Anderson and the LGBTQ2S people. We are now the Chilcoot team chiefs, also on the floor of the House of Commons. But every time it means that you are illuminating this part of Canada's history, this dark part of Canada's history, to those who did not know. And I think that's why, in terms of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that some of the important ones about changing curricula, making mandatory courses in universities, how do we make sure that everybody understands not only the history of that bad policy, but what it did to children, adults, and to communities. To have communities where there are no children playing. To have communities that are empty of the joy, and where, as so often people remind me, that there were no, at times now, births either, because those were taken away. And so communities that only were there at the time of death. And so this was a really terrible time, and as we use the words intergenerational trauma, I think that we're not explaining really what that is, and I think that is why the unveiling of the exhibit from the Legacy of Hope is so important today. That it is to make sure that the understanding of what trauma means, and how we will have that exhibit move and take its place to Parliament when the House rises, to commemorate and educate Canadians on the tragic impact of this legacy. It's also hoping that provincial and territorial governments and legislatures will equally be engaged to host and honor this really important exhibit. The Legacy of Hope does incredible work to facilitate the healing and education process by addressing the intergenerational impact of trauma caused by Indian residential schools. And the foundation says that the success and healing of each survivor begins to heal the whole communities. And I think that's what we heard from Tom this morning, that Tom's journey and wellness is a beacon of hope for those that are still struggling. In order to move forward, we do need to acknowledge the harm that was done, and that the harm was done was not only the terrible abuses that happened, but we have got to also understand being removed from your family, being removed from your culture, being removed from your language. Those harms are so important as we go forward trying to right these wrongs. So it is about making space for people to be heard, for the stigma to be lifted, for us to deliberately make those spaces for the kind of healing that is required, but that needs to be in keeping with cultural traditions, as well as getting back the kind of language and competencies that so many of the young people are asking for now. What the young people know they need is to be competent on the land and the water, and to speak their language, and to be fluent in their language, as well as really understand the cultural traditions of their communities. And that's where I think we're seeing the positive part of intergenerational, as we see the elders and the young people coming together to fill in those gaps and to be able to help one another in terms of this journey forward in healing. And it is about again the work of the foundation that is doing both things, helping with the healing with the survivors, the families, and the communities, but also helping the Canadians understand what this legacy means. I think that sometimes we don't really understand or explain properly the big words like intergenerational trauma. I don't think that on Saturday morning I was able to speak at the launch of the Women's College Hospital run on mental health. And when I think of what we began in the healing after sexual assault, the healing that we aren't actually saying out loud about the tough topics like incest, like childhood trauma, all of those things that we are still not yet comfortable explaining, that hurts people, but also that when we talk about trauma-informed care, we have to be saying not what's the matter with that person, but what happened to that person. And that unless we can step back and see what happened to someone, we aren't going to be able to walk with them in their healing journey. And so we are, I think, today honoring and showing respect to the survivors, and also that we have to recognize that those courageous survivors who had to go to court to actually get any sort of understanding of what had happened. And out of that came the commission, out of that came this new chapter in which all Canadians need to understand the legacy and the harm that was of residential school. So I can never stand in front of this Bill Reid sculpture, and I think some of you know this is the mold of the other statues came. But if you can see this, that Bill Reid's, it's called the Spirit of Haida Gwaii, and you can see that they're not being very nice to one another in this boat, and that there's a lot of biting and as Bill Reid described it, squabbling going on. But Bill meant this statue to explain that person looks like they have a vision of where they're going. The paddles are all in the water in perfect line. They are actually going somewhere. And I always think that this sculpture really speaks to us on our journey of reconciliation. That there's some squabbling going on, there's some hurt still happening, but we actually are on the journey with our paddles in the water, going in the right direction. And so thank you, Miigwech Marcy Kuyanamik.
Thank you very much, Minister Bennett, and very important words and good reminder of, yes, all oars in, and let's get moving forward. Some of us would say we'd like to see a little motor put on those on this moving forward, but thank you very much for that. It's now my pleasure to introduce Teresa Edwards, Executive Director and In-House Legal Counsel for the Legacy of Hope Foundation. And she's going to talk about the exhibit, but I just want to say a few things about the first time I met Teresa. She was working with Native Women's Association, and we were actually going into the prisons to create, in some ways, a comparable journey, a legacy of hope for women inside and who otherwise were not seeing a great deal of hope, almost all of whom very few of whom were not residential school survivors. Almost every single one had also been through the child welfare system, and their attempts to negotiate the poverty, the abuse, the legacy of marginalization and victimization was very much what landed them in the setting we met them. And so I know that this is something that she knows intimately, and I'd like to invite you to come and also, in addition to your wonderful words, to also talk about the exhibit that's here. Thank you. Remind us of the importance of why we're here. 10 years ago, there was an apology, and many would say there's been far too little since then, but part of commemorating is to remind ourselves of all the work we need to do. C'est pour moi un honneur d'être votre maîtresse de cérémonie ce matin et d'être avec vous dans ce magnifique lieu. En territoire algonquin non cédé. I want to thank all the survivors who are here, representatives from the Legacy of Hope Foundation, dignitaries, and everyone assembled today for coming together to mark this 10th anniversary of the Government of Canada's apology to former students of Indian residential schools, as they were referred to. I'd like to begin also by inviting Elders Claudette Commanda, Thomas Lutti, Rita Gordon, and Ega Atagutsiak to open this event with a prayer and healing ceremony. But we've already done that, so thank you for that wonderful event. I also want to thank you for reminding us that we need to continue to put survivors first and foremost in this work. As I'm standing here today, actually, there's a court action happening about a woman who I've known who's actually the longest serving woman prisoner, and she spent 11 years in residential school. And many of you know the work that I've had the privilege and responsibility for doing for the better part of 4 decades has been about being able to walk in, but most importantly, being able to walk out of prisons and see the horrid, tragic travesty of the results of not dealing with the marginalization, the victimization, and then we see the resulting criminalization and imprisonment of massive numbers of Indigenous peoples. And as I stand here today, 39% of women serving federal sentences are Indigenous. One of them has just yet again, the longest serving Indigenous woman, and she's an Indigenous woman and a survivor, has yet again been served injustices that we're trying to remedy. So whenever we think of these issues, we often don't think of the long-term consequences of what those policies have wrought, and I ask you to think about that today. I'd also like you to join me in welcoming now someone who has done a tremendous amount of work to try and assist and move the remedies forward. And moving an entire government is not easy. Moving an entire bureaucracy is not easy. And moving within a context where these issues are often people are more interested in trying to brush them under the rug and ignore them is not easy. And so I want to please join me in welcoming the Honourable Carolyn Bennett, Minister of Crown-Indigenous and Northern Affairs, and someone who many of you don't need to have introduced you to, but please thank you, Minister Bennett, for joining us.
Good morning. Well, Yaksibuk. Nimdeluizi Maldeles, Nina Migma, Nimdeluizi Mukdaway Evidence. My name is Teresa Edwards, and my Mi'kmaq name is Young Firewoman. And we're told that we're to speak our language at every possible time because our ancestors are listening, even when we speak it with an English accent. I want to thank the Creator for this beautiful morning. I want to thank and acknowledge the elders for all their wonderful words of encouragement, and apologize for protocol mistakes in our humanness. We fumble and stumble along. I also want to acknowledge the Algonquin people on whose territory I am a guest today. And I want to acknowledge the youth. If there are youth here, there's a couple of young people I see in the crowd, because when I look at our elders and I look to our youth, you know, we have our connection to the past and we have our connection to the future. And I'll go with the theme of water. I've been saying that all morning to everyone when things have gone not as planned, that we have to be like water, flowing and going, you know, in whatever direction, and accepting when there's a little bump or a little wave that's unexpected, and knowing that as long as we keep going in a good way with a good heart, that everything is working out as it's meant to be. Now that I've acknowledged those, I also want to acknowledge the minister and thank you very much for not only myself, but for President Richard Kistabish from the Legacy of Hope Foundation, and also on behalf of the board of the Legacy of Hope Foundation. He had a family emergency yesterday and had to turn back with his mother-in-law who was passing, so he apologizes for not being able to be here in person. And the board is very grateful for the department, who I'll say CERNA, for blessing us with the funding to be able to create this new exhibit that acknowledges the 10-year apology. And more than that, it's a remembering, it's an acknowledging of what happened, because it's important. We must always do that, because only in doing that can we begin to heal and move forward. And also, it's about building reconciliation, not just for Indigenous peoples to reconcile with what's happened in our families, but for Canadians to take responsibility and vow to take action every day, one day at a time, one step at a time, with everything that they do, whether it be to stand up against racism, to dispel myths, because these are things that continuously are happening. They are not historic. They're happening in our day-to-day. These injustices are continuing to happen. What else did I want to say? It's important to acknowledge, as the minister made very clear when we spoke about intergenerational impacts, I met a gentleman in Timmins, and I keep telling the story, but it's because I was so struck by it. He was homeless, and he is an addict, and still living on the street, traveling. And he explained to me that he was fifth generation residential school survivor. So when you think of it, and he's my age, and I think of myself as youngish, denial, but you know, so when I thought about that, I thought, well, actually, there's got to be 6 or 7 generations of families who've been impacted by residential schools. And when we were doing the planning for this, we were talking about, you know, who in the crowd will be there that's been impacted by residential schools. And I said, well, everybody's been impacted by residential schools. Whether you attended, your mother attended, your grandmother attended, an aunt, an uncle, or whether you were a Canadian who were taught about policies in a not so overt way, or negative beliefs about Indigenous people. That's all impacts from residential schools. So we've all been affected by that. I want to also acknowledge Minister Jolie for helping in the commemorative portion of part of the exhibit as well. It's an opportunity for us to come together, as I mentioned, Canadians, all Canadians, Indigenous and non, to make this commitment of reconciliation, leave a message of hope, take responsibility for what you would like to see happen, what you're willing to do to make a difference in the future, to make a better and inclusive Canada. Also, something that's so important that I love to remind people of is our resilience. Indigenous people, despite all of the stuff that has happened to us, we're still here. We're still here speaking our languages. We're still here doing ceremony. We're still here singing our songs and drumming. and we're still thriving slowly but surely. We're reclaiming our languages and beginning to fly again. The water, the importance of water, giving thanks for that. So as survivors, we also see resilience. My children remind me of that all the time. My mother was a survivor, and my children remind me that I sound more and more like my mother. and I said, I asked them surprisingly, and they said, yeah, she taught you resilience, strength, determination, and that fiery attitude, It's not lost on me. I have to acknowledge her here. So she ran away from residential schools, and she was 86 when she passed last year. So if you can imagine, she ran away from residential schools 70 years ago. And she ran away so many times that they finally brought her before a judge, and they said, you don't have to attend residential school anymore. You're no longer a ward of the state. You can go and work. And what a blessing. What a blessing, But for me to realize what a powerhouse she must have been for this woman who was, 14 to 16, running away, running for her life to get away from residential school. At a time where that was so unheard of. And a lot of people did not make it out of residential school. A lot of people passed. So, a lot of people died there. Children died there. And we have to remember that to ensure that that never happens again. That none of these policies happen again. And many of them are in other forms, with child welfare, with Indigenous women in prison. And we've got to turn that boat around. We need to all have the paddles in the water, but we all need to make sure, where we're steering and have that common vision together that enough is enough and that we have to change directions to ensure that everyone's included and that no one's left behind. And now that I've said a lot of pat phrases, but with a good heart, I want to close by saying, Llewellyn, thank you again. And I am inspired. I am inspired by people that came here today, the allies that we've created. We have a lot of allies, and we can't do it without you as Indigenous people. We have volunteers that are here. We have people from the OPP, federal government employees, provincial government employees. I want to acknowledge all my staff at Legacy Hope Foundation that have been up since 4:30 this morning, as well as the CERNA employees. Probably Minister and Senator Pate rode her bike here. How cool is she? Right? She inspires me to be more fit. Thank you for that. So I'm very grateful. I hope that you can take a moment to enjoy the exhibit. It won't be here long today, but it will eventually be circulating, and we are challenging parliaments across the country to have it out to educate Canadians so that they can be part of reconciliation and take steps to build in healthier, respectful relationships where we truly acknowledge the amazing contributions that Indigenous peoples have made not only to the foundation of this country, but continue to make every day. Llewellyn, thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and condolences. It's always tough to talk about our moms, and especially when they've just passed. And as my mom is dealing with dementia, she passes and comes back. But thank you for that, and also thank you for reminding us of the importance of young people. Last week we had Indigenous youth leaders in the Senate, and we had interactions with Senator Sinclair and Senator Christmas and Senator McCallum, who many of you know is herself a residential school survivor. And to see the incredible hope created by these young people going forward is vitally important and supported by so many others. So thank you. I don't know if Evelyn is here. Corp Matt is here? No? Okay, so I want to thank her for all of the incredible work. Evelyn was a survivor of St. Anne's, and we all know there's no hierarchy of oppression, but we certainly know that some of the worst abuses happen in some of the schools and battles maintenant. Also, je remercie sincèrement tous les personnes qui ont pris la parole ici aujourd'hui. Je crois que cela a été une expérience marquante et très émouvante pour nous tous. Et je m'excuse parce que je dois pratiquer encore mon français. It's probably not evident I was born in Quebec, but there you go.
It's not too long ago at the last residential school closed. So when people talk about survivors, they picture these elders, but really there's another generation behind us that felt that. And then when you talk about intergenerational trauma, people don't understand. I do guest speaking for high schools, and the teacher had a hard time explaining about this intergenerational trauma to the kids because they think it's in the past. And they think we should keep moving forward. How could we move forward if none of this is acknowledged? How could we just say, I'm sorry, and that's it? Because really, I've been doing this line of work, helping other survivors, my brother and I, for the Ontario Indian Residential School Support Services. We are health support and we offer cultural support. And we do that line of work from the grassroots level, where we see it, we feel it, and we do. Our staff does more than what we can do above and beyond. Take, for example, this last minute notice. Why was this done last minute? Why wasn't it planned? Why weren't we aware of any of this? Where are all the survivors? You know, that's being excluded again. And we're being challenged in courts about this IEP. We're being challenged with the child welfare still taking their kids. It's got to stop somewhere. And when we talk about being mindful, don't be mindful, but use your heart, use your eyes, and listen. And don't, you know, when we talk about the survivors, we talk about sexual abuse. We talk about physical abuse. We talk about spiritual abuse. We talk about emotional abuse. We talk about cultural abuse, genocide, not just cultural genocide, but genocide as a whole because it affected our spirit, our physical being. I was one of those survivors that had to eat my vomit when eating that oatmeal. I was one of those survivors that was abused by a priest. I'm not going to hide that. And that kept me so quiet. Though I was so quiet and suffered on my own. I couldn't even talk to my brothers. I couldn't even talk to my mom about that. But now, you know what? I am going to talk about it. Next 2 weeks, I go to Switzerland. And I'm honored to do that. And I don't talk about that much either. But, you know, we are gifted as survivors to go ahead and tell our stories. And I'm proud of my brother Peter for standing up and saying, hey, we're here, why don't you hear our voice? And that has to stop too. Don't quit talking about us. Talk with us. And that legacy of hope work, that's a good thing to have. But have survivors there too also. Every person that's doing this, have survivors. That voice is important to connect. And I'm thankful for my culture for that. It was kind of hurried this morning. You know, everything has to be, but I understand that, but we have to acknowledge that and bring those in, our teachings, because our spirit needs it, we nourish that. And when we do that, it feeds our spirit, it keeps us in a good place. And without that, that was the key place for me, is to return to my culture. That was taken away from me, that I had no right to speak my language, that my hair had to be cut short, and that my name was replaced by a number with a uniform. And what does that remind you? Incarceration. Why? Because I'm an Indian, as in legal terms. But I'm a Anishinaabe Iskoy, I'm a Mumishki Iskoy. So now that we come together, I hope that this day isn't forgotten. Like 10 years has passed, and still there's a lot of challenges, a lot of work to be done. And I'm going to be a part of that by my voice. I'm going to be proactive by speaking out and saying enough is enough. Let's get moving forward and let's start doing this thing. Reconciliation, whatever that means. Show it to me. Show it to the survivors. Just don't throw words at us and everything else. Walk with us. Be with us. I thank you for listening, and I hope you walk away with something today other than that apology, but something that you could carry on and learn from this and say, okay, what do we do here as Canadians? How do we help them? And I'm proud to be a survivor because my mother was and my grandmother was. And there's other siblings that have been here. 150,000, don't forget that. And then there's 150,000 intergeneration after generation. So the work has just begun. We have more to do. And I think the health support workers here, if you could please stand up. These are the people that hold people together while we gather on these, to provide that emotional support, that cultural support, because without them, you know, when somebody is in distress, we're the ones that hold them up. And I thank you for that and being with us. Jimmy Glitch.
And we're not going to apologize for crashing the speaker.
Okay, so this is the entry. This is our east entry door. So we have an eastern entry. So, hello, this is our eastern entry door. Welcome to our exhibit. You can just come through this way. So we do have tablets here that you can put a message of hope, peace and reconciliation, and then we have some handwritten ones as well. And when you're done putting your message in, you can drop it into the basket.